All right, hello everyone, and welcome to another Flight Lab. Copilot in Action, the series that we've been doing. Today, we're going to really dive into tools and strategies for Copilot agents to give you as much information as possible on how we use the different tools of the Microsoft platform to address the business needs that you may have. With that, let's go ahead and start with our PowerPoint. And today, we're basically going to frame some of the content in PowerPoint and then from there show it inside of the Power Platform, Copilot Studio, wherever we're going to be going today to recommend, obviously, those tools and strategies as we go through this session today. With that, just a couple things for housekeeping before we get started. Obviously, a copy of this recording will be available after the event through the link. We'll take time for questions and comments throughout. So I'm watching chat in the background here. So go ahead, introduce yourself, say what you love about the Flight Lab so far, or Confab, or Stone Ridge, or AI in general. We're really curious. And then obviously make sure to give us feedback in our event feedback survey that you can really fill out anytime throughout the session. It just helps us obviously focus more and maybe get better speakers, right? And get people involved and engaged as we go through this. All right, with that, let's go through kind of the high level agenda of what we're going to be talking about today, because we really wanted to take this and make it much more practical for you so that when you look at agents, you really understand the building blocks and strategies that are used to build agents, because we're finding out more and more as we go through this adventure that it's a new tool. People don't know how to use it, and giving that knowledge and that information makes it so that you're able to create some really amazing agents that do actually provide better capabilities, better support, better automation inside of your business. The first thing that we're going to talk through is obviously some of the agent design concepts that are out there, because one of the things that we're seeing is that it is, like I've said before in the past a couple of times, and others have said this as well, it's really easy to build an agent, but it's really hard to build a good agent. So we're going to talk through how we use then Copilot Studio to really manage the creation of an agent. And I know there are other technologies that are out there that can be used to build agents on the Microsoft platform, but Copilot Studio has been earmarked as the first party platform that can be used to build autonomous agents and chat-based agents that really help you go to market quicker than, as you can imagine, when it comes to some of those capabilities. We're going to talk about why we use Power Automate with Copilot Studio, because a lot of people think Copilot Studio is all we need. Well, really, you need way more than just Copilot Studio to make effective agents inside of your organization. Power Automate is one of those critical components that needs to be used in order to really then do those actions inside of different types of systems regarding basically anything in terms of data retrieval or even some types of transactional data as we go through that. So we're going to talk a little bit about Power Automate and how that works inside of the flow. Then we're going to talk a little bit of this concept called AI Builder, where we scale our agents even further compared to where they are through the use of Copilot Studio and Power Automate by now incorporating these prompts that we can have inside of our agent design as well. And scaling this is really important because one of the big feedback items that we typically get is that, and I'll put myself on do not disturb here, is that we basically can cut down on the cost of these particular prompts by using AI Builder in our actual orchestration using Copilot Studio. And this feels a little bit weird because a lot of people, they think Copilot Studio is the generative capability for an agent that should do everything. Well, it does do some things, but there's some really big advantages to potentially using, for example, Power Automate and AI Builder, even from a cost perspective as well. So we're going to talk through that. And then finally, what we're going to do here is we're going to take a sneak peek at Agent 365. I just want to show where Microsoft is really trying to unify then, obviously, that governance perspective with these agents. And one of the concepts that we talk about really at Stoneridge is really, you can imagine an agent almost as an end user, and that end user can then interact with your data. But how do you really restrict the security, the users, the number of agents that you have, who can deploy, who can't deploy, for example? Agent 365 really focuses on that, and we're going to make sure we at least crack the hood open to take a quick look at that. So with that pitter patter, let's get at her. Let's talk about obviously really our first topic here, which is really our agent design concepts that are best practice in my mind. I've built a lot of agents now, but at the same point, a lot of people, when they first get into obviously the building of an agent, they really don't understand the architectural design that's related to it. So what I want to talk about here first really is that there's a couple of key components that are really important when we start looking at building out an agent. The first concept that you need to just kind of hold near and dear to you is that it's really easy to build an agent. It's really easy to go into Copilot Studio, stand up that particular agent, add knowledge to it, and then interact with it, right? We've seen that many times as we even interact within our copilot.microsoft.com, for example, or our M365 Copilot experience, where we can really rapidly add knowledge and it kind of works. But that's the problem. It kind of works, right? What we're finding is it's really hard to build a good agent because a lot of people don't understand the patterns that are involved to make these agents more successful in the autonomous tasks or the chat-based tasks you want to tackle. One of the things that's really interesting about this, which is kind of the inverse of what people typically start at when they look at building an agent, is that they want to make an agent that really handles complex tasks because that's what AI is all about, right? It's all about tackling the most complex tasks that we have inside of the organization. But really, complexity is a very big killer of a good automated agent or any agent for that matter. If you think about it, adding more complexity into an agent means that there are more conditions that we need to think through, train, or even, for example, sandbox. Look at it like a bowling alley where we've got basically the helper or the bumpers on the bowling alley lane, right? Basically, in a lot of those given scenarios, in order to get a consistent result with AI, we need to put some type of boundaries that are related to it. So that complexity can be a very major factor then when basically incorporating an agent into your environment. So you want to start with actually the opposite side of this, where it's not the complexity, it's the low complexity, high time that are going to be probably the best scenarios for AI. And over time, that'll happen, right? We're going to see more and more capabilities added. And at the end of this, I'm going to show you something pretty cool where we've got AI from 2023 compared to 2026 and where we are inside of that adventure. So once again, focus on obviously the complexity perspective. Now, focusing on an agent to cover a specific task is better than making an agent that tackles all. So the example I love to give, you don't make an accounts receivable agent. You make an agent that is in accounts receivable that tackles a particular task inside of accounts receivable. Maybe that is, I have an agent that after a sales order is posted or invoiced more specifically, that it will check the credit limit of any customers that have been invoiced for the day and then send emails to sales team members stating that they've hit credit limit and that you need to follow up with them, or it creates an opportunity in Dynamics 365 sales, right? What we want to do is we want to really compartmentalize an agent to tackle a specific task. And the reason for that is pretty simple. The more topics we have, the more tools, the more knowledge we add to an agent, the less accurate that agent can be. And sometimes the more prone an agent can be to actually go down a path where it covers a topic that you don't want it to go into, or that it covers a knowledge source, for example, for its response that is not the right product because it chose the wrong document in the knowledge source based upon the prompt that was created. So once again, focusing agents around a specific task is way better than making agents that cover multiple tasks. And here's the benefit from your perspective with this, especially on the Microsoft platform. You don't get billed by the number of agents that you have. If you add 50 tasks that AR or accounts receivable, your accounts receivable department is tackling, you don't get charged 50 times for 50 different agents. Instead, you could have 50 agents and their consumption when they use AI-based generative responses is really what you get billed at. And the cool thing about it is that you have more accuracy then because those agents aren't then trying to figure out, well, what topic do I need to go down? And if you think about the design around an agent, you don't have to put topic descriptions that then are conflictive, or you have to basically then from there figure out how do you make a description better so that the agent always enters based upon the prompt that's being provided. So once again, this is really important. And the last thing I'd like to say is not focusing an agent does really risk inconsistent results. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, we use topics to guide the steps inside of a business process that we tackle. If you look at a topic, it's no different than what we do in our normal workflow as humans interacting with machines, where we have step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, so on and so forth that we tackle. And at each of these different steps, sometimes there's recovery or other actions that need to occur in order to get us back on track, basically. For an agent, I think a lot of people have this misconception that they're super intelligent and that they're able to figure out all the deductive reasoning and logic and steps that are going to be superior to a human being. We're not there yet. We've said this many times. I like to equate AI to a 6 or 7-year-old where you can basically refine what that agent is going to do by using those topics and then really drive some really great results with it. So this is going to be kind of the foundational design concepts that you should always keep in mind when looking at an agent when you're building it. And I would argue that this goes across any agent build out that you do on any platform, whether it's Microsoft, Anthropic, OpenAI, or even Google Gemini, for example, and all the new agents that are coming out and capabilities like Operator from OpenAI. The important portion here is that you design agents that are as lightweight as possible, but very impactful as they go through that process. Now, the first concept that we're going to talk through a little bit more here is about how do we basically then make sure that this agent does what we want it to do, right? And so we have obviously those core design principles that we typically interact with, but what we want to do is we want to make sure that agents have good instructions that have been provided to the agent. When you think about an agent and when you're interacting with it or when you're having some type of automation event that needs to occur, the instructions are embedded inside of that agent so that when you provide a prompt or interact with it with a chat experience or an automated interaction, that those instructions are what the agent uses to initially ground itself on how it is actually supposed to answer questions. Examples of that, you can have an agent where you tell it inside of the instructions to always use, for example, tools to answer the questions for the end user. Or you could say, always enter this specific topic first. Or you could do, here's your workflow that you need to go through every single time to respond then to an end user. Or here's the tone, so on and so forth. But good instructions center the agent on what it does. And meaning matters. If you think about an agent and how a large language model works, it's all about context. And if you think about then how we access the information in that inference, we want to basically supply as much information as possible to make sure the context of the model is focused towards the right knowledge repositories that are either trained inside of the inference, which is typically when they do a new GPT, right, where you can ask it a question and it'll tell you why the sky is blue and it doesn't have to go to the internet to get that. Or as well on top of that, how that particular inference should then basically address the questions that are being asked. And the context then is going to be really important. This is kind of weird for people to first start with because they're so used to just saying, this is what I want you to do without giving any background or reasoning around it. Whereas when you give that background and instructions and reasoning up front, the prompts that then follow should support those instructions that you have. So therefore, the accuracy is increased in terms of what information that inference or that agent, as we call them, will actually tackle. And I'll use inference and agent pretty synonymously. Obviously, agents and inferences, an inference runs on a large language model. An agent, I'd argue, with the tool set that we have is a little bit bigger than just a large language model, but the net result is that it's basically generating generative content, right? So the other thing that's really important here, though, is that the tooling that we have it's not one tool conquers all, right? It's kind of like business systems. And what's really interesting about large language models is they're more akin to business systems that we've implemented like ERP and CRM than they are to, for example, Outlook and some of the classic stack, as we call them. But the right tools are needed to make sure that we really satisfy those core needs of a business. The scope, for example, the budget that is needed for that as well, and then the capabilities that are needed, right? So, for example, using some of these models can be really, really expensive depending upon the tasks that we're trying to accomplish. And we're going to kind of show that here today as well, because those tools help you reduce the cost to make it then so that it is something that is cost beneficial then for your organization. So, like I said, we're going to talk more about those tools, but using those right tools, and I'll just kind of summarize at high level. Copilot, Power Automate, and AI Builder, in terms of that hierarchy typically as well, is going to be the right tools then to make some of these phenomenal agents. The other thing to note here, agents have to have an out. If you tell an agent to select between one of two things, and let's say it runs into a condition where there needs to be a third, how do you want that agent to respond in those given scenarios? How do you have an end user, for example, report to you when all of a sudden they run into a blocker as they go through that, right? So having agents in your design have an out in some way to basically inform either the agent creator or others that these exceptions are happening are really going to be critical in your agent design. The other thing to note here as well is that you're going to want to iterate on prompts to refine the output that you want. And what do I mean by this? Well, it's pretty self-explanatory, but I'll give just a really like a real use case that we went through with a customer. An example of that is that we had a bunch of data that we were sending to the agent, and it was doing mathematical operations because in the prompt we said make sure to reply back to the end user's request that they have that's embedded inside of this prompt. And when we did that, what we noticed is that we ran into what we're going to talk about here, some what are called MRCR issues, where we were getting inaccurate summation or mathematical operations for the data sets that we were working with that we were sending to that large language model. So to iterate off of that, we had to update the prompt and say, don't do math calculations. Only show the values that are there or answer questions that are revolving around those values, for example. So we basically incorporated that into the prompt then to refine it so that we were able to squish these other bugs as we went through it as part of that process. So once again, iterating on these prompts for the output, the capabilities that you want to see is really going to be important. Prompting isn't exactly like this, but I would argue prompting is getting more and more to be like a programming language for AI and even for business and computer systems in the future here, compared to where we were in the past, where we weren't using natural language and we would use if then case statements, switches, whatever we we're going to call it, to do that logic. Instead, now we can do it inside of natural language. So once again, using this to build out these prompts and capabilities is going to be a really critical component with it. So how do you use Copilot Studio then in this design? So great, Scott, I've got this base concept in place. I'm going to build an agent with good instructions. I'm going to iterate on my prompts. I'm going to really make sure I kind of give it its swim lanes so that it doesn't actually, go off target. I'm going to have outs that are revolving around it. So that way, I can basically increase the capabilities of this agent or the accuracy with it. Well, where do I even start? Well, you start at Copilot Studio. So Copilot Studio is what we classify as the perfect orchestrator for AI enablement. Well, what is an orchestrator? I could use a different word, a manager. Basically, Copilot Studio allows for us to define what the agent is going to do, its instructions, how it's going to tackle it, and what it's going to use in that process to address that particular task. What it can also do, though, is that it can actually have pathing inside of it, A/B pathing, for example, where if a particular condition occurs inside of data, inside of a formula, inside of an event, inside of what it gathers, it can make a really good decision on where it needs to go next. And this is a really important concept because when we think about Copilot Studio, we don't want more than likely Copilot Studio to do rich generation of content. And I'm going to argue why it can do that, but that might not be the best thing for it to do. Whereas when we use it for an orchestrator to use all these different tools that we have and then use it, for example, to kind of path for us on where it needs to go to address that particular issue, we can really work on the core capability really of the agent versus trying to focus on the generative capabilities of the agent. Where does this come into really play? So an example would be when you're interacting with an agent and you've got questions around data, well, having that agent then answer those questions, look at your prompt, then identify the right data source to grab, use Power Automate, for example, to grab and format data so it's LLM optimized, is going to be a way better methodology and strategy for orchestration compared to letting the agent try to figure it out itself and not having any of that orchestration then defined inside of the agent. So once again, if you look at Copilot as an orchestrator or manager of the process and the steps it goes through with it, you're really starting to align effectively on what Copilot Studio can do for your automation needs. Now, there's going to be arguments on both sides of this. Don't think that what I'm saying is a hard and fast rule, but I will say that more commonly because of the needs that a business has, using, for example, then Power Automate and AI Builder gives us more granular control over the prompts that we interact with from a generative AI perspective. So like I said, Copilot Studio is not ideal for generative concept in itself, but it's great at doing that coordination of those steps in workflow. And the interesting thing that it really influences is how it determines whether knowledge, tools, actions, or other agents are chosen to answer the question or prompt that's been prevented by the end user. So once again, think about the agent only at the highest level from a Copilot Studio perspective to generate really the pathing that's related to it and to streamline, obviously, that experience as part of that orchestration. So let's kind of show that because I think it's great to talk through the concept, but the next question is going to be, well, where does that exist and what do I do to tackle that? Well, here's an example that I have of an agent where basically it's going to be doing orchestration then to address whatever need it has. So I'm going to go to my agents, and one of the agents I have that's going to be just a demonstration agent that I created is this open commitments agent that we generated inside of Copilot Studio. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about, for example, different types of models that can be used. So an example here inside of this model, if I go into our overview, what we're going to see here is that inside of Copilot Studio, we can use these different models then to increase the accuracy of the decision-making support or orchestration of the agent. So what else does it do? Well, it also can generate content, right? So we know that Copilot Studio does have the ability to do generative content inside of it, and it'll use this model. But it really begs a question. If I want to build an amazing agent, sometimes I have to take data that we had before and I need to strip out values inside of it. Like if a user says that they want to look up a particular purchase order, I need to strip out the purchase order number that they inquired potentially inside of the prompt. And whenever I use the generative capabilities of Copilot Studio, it costs a message potentially, which is actually pretty expensive compared to maybe using AI Builder and a token. And we're going to talk about that concept in a second here. But what's interesting about this, once again, is that these models allow for us then to refine the accuracy that the orchestrator or the manager will do. It's kind of funny to say it like this. A better model, a smarter manager, right? So think about it like that. And that's basically where you can then design some really great capabilities. Now, inside of this agent, what we did is we built some topics then that are related to it. And what you'll see here is that there's only a couple of topics that an agent can actually choose, right? Whereas there's many others that are activities that are inside of here. You nailed it, Tracy. Better model equals a smarter manager, right? So, but what's interesting here then is that when we think about like an orchestrator, what I'm doing here, if I click on this orchestrator, Fantastic. I have, for example, a topic where I set debug values. I then set variables, and then I get open commitments for a given project. And then what I do here is I basically do a couple of checks to say, hey, have we gotten the project data related to this? And if we have not gotten the project data, then go grab the data that's related to it and then use a prompt inside of here to figure out our next steps that need to occur. So as you can see here, I'm not generating content, so to speak. I'm going through a sequence of steps to take basically whatever the automation need is and then refine what I want that agent to do. Basically, I'm giving the agent instructions or work instructions on what to do like a person would do. What do we do in a business system? We create training documentation that tells you step by step what you need to do in order to enter a sales order. Same concept right here. That's where the orchestrator really becomes powerful as part of this process. Now, beyond the orchestrator, there are other tools that we want to use to gather and grab data. Empower Automate is going to be one of the most powerful tools that you can use. More specifically, Power Automate inside of Copilot Studio not only allows for us to interact then with the agent and grab information and bring it to it inside of that pathing that we are looking at, but it also drives, for example, triggers. So when a Power Automate thing happens in a flow, for example, an agent can be called from that Power Automate. And this is very powerful. Basically, an agent can be called from anything that Power Automate can have a trigger related to it on. So this means non-Microsoft products. This means any type of product that's out there that uses Power Automate potentially can be incorporated then into your workflow as part of that process. But what we don't want to do is we don't want to build a Power Automate flow that does all this. We want an agent potentially to do it because the agent will handle the orchestration. And then from there, the Power Automate becomes a very almost like a dumb tool in some ways to grab data or trigger data or interact with it. But we make our flows very compact and quick and not very complex. And this is really important because when we look at the entire picture of an agent, it's going to drive obviously what happens here. So what's interesting with Power Automate is that knowledge sources can be very powerful in certain scenarios. But if we think about data inside of an agent, it may not be knowledge sources. We may want to refine that data even further. We also, for example, may not want to use MCP because we want to really put those swim lanes really tight around that process. And with Power Automate, that allows us then to create those flows that allow us to interact with that for that decision-making support. But the other aspect of this as well to kind of consider is that data also needs to be considered in your agents in terms of the format and the quality of that data to do better processing. And what do I mean by that? Well, we keep talking about really this concept that's called, and I apologize, I screwed up here, it's MRCR. So really what that is when we think about MRCR, we are really talking about what's called a multi-round co-reference resolution. Fancy word, right? Well, you know what that word means? Basically, it's saying based on the data that was sent to the large language model, how accurate are you at picking out specific questions that I may ask of it inside of there? And that accuracy matters, especially for different types of conditions that need to occur. So ironically, when we look at data that's interacting with, for example, large language models, there's a couple of things that are really major. The first, obviously, is that human readable data like JSON and XML isn't actually better for large language models. In fact, I could argue that tab separated values and comma separated values are better for large language model interaction because they don't have the extra fluff and tags around it that makes it where, for example, if I want to send 64,000 characters or 128,000 characters, I want to squish that down as much as possible so that when I ask for a recall rate for those characters, I have a high percentage of success related to it. If you haven't followed us on Confab or on other flight labs, you'll probably know that more data means less accuracy for a model typically. And so squishing that down makes it really powerful. So data matters, and Power Automate allows for us to do some really cool things with that, right? We can then take, for example, data that we get from a business system, and then we can put it into a tab separated value and then provide it to the agent. And the agent looks at it like a table and can understand the columns that are related to it and can usually then do better predictability and processing around it. Now, there's always an exception. Once again, I always preface that because if you think about it, the exception would be like maybe your agent has to evaluate the data types that are inside of the data. Well, then maybe you're going to want to use JSON or XML with some of those different attributes or tags that are related to it. Or maybe it's in the instructions for the tasks that need to occur, right? So once again, making sure that you focus on that data will help, and Power Automate can obviously help you with that particular process as well. So let's look at like how do we then incorporate Power Automate inside of these agents to go through that processing. And what I'll do is I'll stick, obviously, we'll go back to our existing commitments agent that's inside of here. So remember, this topic, the get open commitments for the project, is triggered. And basically what we have is we have a requirement that states that if we don't have a project, that we need to go grab the data that's related to the project. Now, one of the things that an agent can do, which is a really interesting concept, is that in Copilot Studio, an agent isn't hardwired and linked into a large language model for every single interaction it does. What do I mean by that? Well, you select the model, but that model is only used when it's trying to evaluate the knowledge tools, agents, topics that need to be covered. Or, for example, when I add a generative answer inside of here as a block inside of my workflow that I'm designing, well, then it uses that model as well to do that. But what I can also do is I can set things like variables, meaning that the agent can actually have a memory related to it with that data that's inside of the memory, but I'm not sending that then with each prompt that I'm interacting basically with the large language model. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm storing that so I don't have to have roundabout trips to basically then gather that data. So if you think about like projects, and if you got a bunch of purchase orders that are related to projects, when I tell this is the project I want to interact with, I don't want it to go back and forth constantly with every inquiry I do to go grab that data. Instead, when they give me the project, I want to preload or cache that information locally inside of that agent to be basically interact with it. So in this agent, we call, for example, this topic, and it always stays focused on this topic. But the very first time it calls this topic, it grabs the data that's related to it. So what I can do here then inside of Copilot Studio is to grab that data so I can then use it in other processes. What I can do is I can create a Power Automate flow. And how do I do that? Well, I click on Add a Tool, and then you would do basically a new agent flow to complete or interact basically with those tasks. And in this example, I've got a Get Projects, which is a topic that's inside of here. And in that Get projects topic, you can see here that I actually have a prompt that's going to go and then grab that information inside of Power Automate. So here is the Get Projects Power Automate that I have. And what we bring back then is a JSON in this example to go through that information. Now, once again, you don't always have to put it to TSV or CSV, right? If it's a project record, that's really small to start with, right? So it's a great way then to just kind of focus on where you don't have a lot of data, you don't have to do a lot of changes to the plumbing, but where you do have maybe some more data, you can make changes to it. Now, if I look at my Get Projects Power Automate as an example by clicking on the View Flow Details inside of here, what we'll see is that it'll actually bring us then into Power Automate from within Copilot Studio. So this is a really big thing, meaning we have a very direct integration here then between Copilot Studio and Power Automate, which then allows me, in this example, I'm doing a Get projects, and when I go to my designer here, it's not very complex. I have, when the agent calls the flow, I have a variable that I create, and then what I do is I go ahead, based upon the case statement, and I grab the items that are inside of the project table, and I filter the project based upon the project ID that I passed inside of the Power Automate flow. So if we go ahead just really quickly here and I center it now and I look at when my agent is called here, what you'll also see inside of here is that I can pass values to Power Automate, and then I can also then return values from Power Automate back to the agent where it can then store those next to the agent. And in the example that we were talking about, if I actually go back here as an example, what we'll see then inside of the actual process or topic that we're interacting with is that it actually does then set some of those variables based upon those responses that come inside of here. So if I go back, for example, to our Git projects that are inside of here, and we see then down here a little bit further that we then have that event that occurs, you can see then that I'm assigning variables that the agent can interact with as we go through that processing. So once again, just mentioning this because Power Automate, as you can imagine, it can do transactions for you then. The good and bad thing about this is it provides a parameterized view of interacting with data and retrieving data. But I will say that this is where people got a little bit frustrated because they're like, well, if it's AI, I should just be able to tell it a project and it should be able to go do that. Well, it can, and you can use MCP to do this, but consistency matters. And one of the things I just want to kind of mention here for everyone that's online right now is that you don't expect AI when you're designing AI and building AI-based solutions like an agent. It's not like it's going to be you're reducing 90% of the budget to build these particular agents and automations. Instead, maybe initially you're reducing it by 30%, and as you build your tooling and capability, maybe you can go way faster and get it to 50, 60, 70%, right, in terms of the reduction of cost when building an agent. But there's still work that has to be done. A really good way to look at this would be for an agent, for what it can do compared to you writing it inside of code to tackle that. It should typically be 30% faster minimum in terms of that development cost. And I highlight development cost because there are other opportunity areas where you could go even further. Training documentation generation, when doing development, documenting it, testing, verifying syntax. Like there's lots of these different test cases that the agent does on the agent. Like there's lots of things that you can create that help you then scale that savings. But once again, don't think that you can't that you're not going to be able to that you're going to get away, with just not doing anything. You have to build some of that scaffolding that's related to it. So like I said, Power Automate for getting data, retrieving it, formatting it, and even doing then some of those different types of transactions is important. Another one that we have inside of here, for example, that then generates or creates an email is that we can basically through and then with Power Automate pass the information to that Power Automate to then generate emails as well. So you can use Power Automate to basically automate any action inside of an agent. All right, let's keep rolling here because we've only got a couple more minutes and I want to make sure we talk about AI Builder and some of the costs inside of here as well. So one of the things to note is that when you're interacting with an agent, a really important learning is that you're finding out that, yeah, you can buy a 200,000 or 2,000 or 20,000, message pack for a certain amount of dollars from Microsoft. But you know what? I'm asking it to extract text. And I don't want to create a bunch of code in Power Automate or through Logic apps or, through, whatever it may be to extract that, right? I don't want to use a regex expression and try to figure all that out. Instead, I want to take the data that was provided and I want to run a prompt against it. Well, inside of Copilot Studio, you can do that. But the problem is, once again, you have no control over the AI model that's used, and every model has a cost related to it. So when using AI Builder, we can use what are called AI prompts to basically build custom prompts that allow us then to use different models that may be cheaper to perform that given task. An example, why wouldn't we use a nano model or a mini model, as they call it, which costs substantially less than the full auto or chat-based GPT 5.2? right? Instead, like especially if we've got like an entrance point where we're evaluating whether or not we need to have the agent do further processing, well, do we pay for a more expensive model up front that does that conditionality up front, and then we use smaller models for the rest of the process? Or do we just do a gut check, so to speak, using a smaller model and then use more complex models as we go through the process? So AI Builder allows for us to do that. Instead of messages, we can now harness tokens. And I really compare it to kind of the cell phone days. I might be dating myself a little bit, where carriers back in the day, US Cellular in our area, would round to the nearest minute. And then aerial communications came out and they said, you know what? We're going to bill you to the second, so that, when we used to buy 200-minute plans, it would go to the second then as opposed to the minute. So what's interesting about AI Builder is it allows us basically to have more granular control than over obviously some of those costs that we interact with. And so with AI Builder, we can have that granular control. We can create very complex prompts that pass that data. We can create scenarios where orchestration of the agent is not maybe needed, but generative content can be created. And we can also use custom models in Azure AI Foundry to theoretically then impact cost or capabilities inside of our environment to drive that. So what does this look like then from an agent perspective? Well, going back to our agent here, one of the things that we passed is this project number. This is a variable, right? So basically, when we're interacting with the chat experience here, we're going to ask about a project, and it's going to say, well, what project do you want us to focus on? Well, for me to get that project information, if I scroll up here a little bit further, you can see that I have a prompt that enters when I do the get projects. So basically, I've got what I call the initial inquiry text, which is the prompt that's inside of here that gets passed then to this prompt. And how do you create a prompt? Well, very similar to adding a tool. You click on the add a tool, and then you create a new prompt using the AI builder, using the default model of that AI builder. So if I take a look at this, identify the project number or project name, because maybe the prompt says, I'd like you to look up the Skyhawk project, or maybe I want you to look up project ABC123. Well, as I click on, for example, this prompt inside of here, this is where I have that granular control then over this, where I can, for example, in this one, I give it all the instructions that are related to it. I pass in the prompt that the user gave, and then I tell it what I want the output to be. And what I do is I use the GPT-4.1 mini model to do that. And why do I do that? Look at the cost here. Basic prompt, for example, with an AI builder, not a premium model or a standard model, 0.0001 cents, right? So if you think about it, the number of tokens, so 1,000 tokens usually is about 4,000 characters. In this example, I'm passing a project number to it, and I'm using a really, really small model. So that way, basically, I can reduce the cost then related to this and not even consume Copilot Studio messages theoretically to do that processing. Now, the only other thing to note here is that there is the ability, as you can see, to use a lot of these different types of models, either basic, standard, or premium, but you can also use Azure AI Foundry models. And why would you want to use Azure AI Foundry models? They're priced based upon millions of tokens. They're priced based upon how much data you send, the input, how much was used that was cached that referenced the prior input, and then what is the output for 1 million tokens. Remember, a token is typically 4 characters of text. So if we look at this, if we want to generate 4 megabytes of content from a large language model using GPT-5.2, using Azure AI Foundry, we're going to spend about $14 depending upon what the input is as well with it. But what you can see here is that you can get even cheaper depending upon the different types of models that you want to choose. So if you want to use the mini model, for example, those 1 million or 4 megabytes of data can actually reduce down to $4.40. Or if we use 4.1 or whatever the model is, we can scale that price down. Now, the only thing I want to mention here is just a caveat. Remember, inside of the custom models, you still pay for the tokens that are used by the AI builder model. So you do have to think through like those scenarios as you do that process as well. So just something to note. But like you can see here, if I test this, we'll see the results that it'll bring back and whether or not it detected the project or not. You can see it presents that in JSON, which I can use then basically in the agent. Now, I know we're getting to the end of time here. I want to make sure we go through Agent 365 just really rapidly. Obviously, we're able to build tons and tons of agents, right? Well, how do we govern all this and make sure we're getting the right adoption? How do we register, control, and secure those agents? And then how do I basically see this to basically increase the adoption, security, and those agent metrics that are related to it? Well, Agent 365 is something that we have obviously on our pre-sales tenant. And what's really cool about this is that we can see all the different agents that are installed inside of the environment. And we can also then see the different types of technologies that are used then to drive those agents, whether we're using Copilot Studio as an example. And then inside of Copilot Studio, we have these agents, and we can then see, for example, the security and compliance, the permissions that are related to this particular agent. So this allows obviously for us to then really have a central hub to interact obviously with agents, to monitor that activity, protect sensitive information, and then really use this Agent 365 experience to see where our agents are going and what they're doing. So with that, one final thing I want to note here. I want to show this kind of in the background here as we kind of just wrap up, just to show an example of where we had, as you can see here, AI generating video content of Will Smith eating spaghetti. And it is absolutely astounding to see the difference between 2023 and now 2026, where we have AI agents that are able to really build out, or large language models, or technically large multimodals, that are able to build out full rich interactions, scene interactions with Will Smith eating spaghetti, and it's getting better and better and better. And the reason I'm just kind of mentioning this is that when we think about, for example, what we're going to see inside of the Microsoft stack, we're going to see even more of those capabilities in the future. With that, I wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining our session today for Flight Lab. Next month, we're going to have another great series or episode to go through, so make sure you join and have a great rest of your week. Thank you again for your time.